The courtroom fell silent the moment my own father pointed his finger at me like I was a criminal. "She has no place here," he snarled loud enough for the entire room to hear. "This girl abandoned this family 20 years ago." A ripple of laughter spread through the gallery. His lawyer smirked. My brother Daniel just looked away. And I, Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Thompson, United States Army, stood there in my Navy blazer with my hands clasped behind my back, saying nothing. 22 years of service, 2 combat deployments, a Bronze Star, and a Purple Heart I never once mentioned at family dinners. None of it mattered. To my father, I was still just the daughter who went off to play soldier, while his golden boy Daniel stayed home and supposedly built an empire, until one old man in the back of the room saw the small pin on my lapel, and everything changed. I want to tell you that I felt nothing in that moment, but that would be a lie. I felt everything. I felt the years pressing down on my shoulders every Thanksgiving where my chair was pushed a little further from the head of the table, every phone call that ended before I could say anything that mattered, every time my father introduced my brother Daniel to his golf buddies as my son, the one who's going to run everything, while I stood a few feet away, unnamed, unnoticed. I had learned a long time ago that the Thompson family had a very specific hierarchy, and I was somewhere below the family dog. My name is Rebecca Thompson. I'm 40 years old. For the last 22 years I've served in the United States Army, and for the last several of those I've held the rank of lieutenant colonel. I've commanded soldiers through places most people only see on the news, places where the ground shakes and the air tastes like smoke and copper. I've made decisions that meant the difference between someone's son coming home or not. But none of that mattered in my father's kitchen or his living room, or apparently his courtroom. To Harold Thompson, I would always be the daughter who went off and played soldier instead of doing something respectable like his real child, his golden child Daniel. I sat quietly through most of my life listening to my father praise Daniel for things that frankly never happened. Daniel didn't run a business. Daniel ran a car dealership into bankruptcy twice and got bailed out both times by money nobody talked about at dinner. But in my father's mind, my brother was a builder of empires, and I was a girl who couldn't hold down a real job. I stopped correcting him when I was 26. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to prove your worth to someone who has already decided you don't have any. Eventually, you just stop trying, and you let the silence do the talking. That silence had followed me into this courtroom today, on a case that was supposed to be about my grandmother's estate, about a piece of land that had been in our family for 3 generations, and about a will that Daniel and my father seemed a little too eager to have altered. I hadn't said much since I walked in. I hadn't needed to. I had learned in the Army that the loudest person in the room is rarely the most dangerous one. My father never learned that lesson. He confused volume with strength his entire life. "She hasn't been part of this family in 15 years. My father continued, warming up now that he had an audience. "She shows up when there's money involved, typical." A few chuckles rippled through the gallery. My mother, sitting beside him, kept her eyes on her hands. Margaret Thompson had spent 38 years married to a man who needed to be right more than he needed to be kind, and she had long since decided that peace, even a false peace, was safer than the alternative. I didn't blame her. I understood fear. I had just learned somewhere along the way not to let it run my life. I wore a simple navy blazer that day, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed for attention. But pinned neatly to my lapel was a small emblem, the kind most civilians walk past without a second glance. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't fashion. It was earned in places I don't talk about at dinner parties, through nights I don't revisit unless I have to. I never explained it to my family because they never asked. Not once in 20 years. Did anyone in that courtroom or at any Thompson family gathering ask me what that pin actually meant? As the laughter in the room began to settle, an older man in a gray cardigan walked past the defense table toward the exit doors, moving with the careful, deliberate gait of someone who had spent years keeping order in that very room. I recognized the look of a man who had seen every kind of person cross that threshold, liars, grievers, the guilty, the innocent, and had learned to read them all before they said a word. His eyes swept the room out of old habit, and then, for just a second, they landed on me, or more precisely on the small pin catching the fluorescent light on my lapel. He stopped walking. His shoulders straightened just slightly, and I saw something shift behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe disbelief. He was maybe 74 years old, a man who had clearly retired from something that required discipline. The kind of discipline you don't lose even after the uniform comes off. My father was still talking, still enjoying his moment, completely unaware that something in the room had just changed. I kept my eyes forward, my face calm, the way I'd trained myself to do under far worse circumstances than this. But inside I felt the smallest flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time in front of my family. I felt seen. The old man's name was Samuel Brooks, though I wouldn't learn that until later. In that moment he was just a stranger in a gray cardigan standing frozen in the aisle of a courtroom that had seconds ago been laughing at my expense. He turned around slowly, fully this time, and looked at me the way you look at something you weren't expecting to see again in your lifetime. Not shock, exactly. Recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has spent decades around a certain kind of person and knows exactly what he's looking at. I gave him the smallest nod. Just enough. It's a habit you develop after enough years in service, a way of acknowledging another person who's carried weight without making a scene of it. I didn't expect anything to come of it. I certainly didn't expect what happened next. Samuel Brooks straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and rendered a salute. A real one. Sharp, precise, held for exactly the right beat before dropping to his side. In a courtroom. In the middle of a probate hearing about my grandmother's land. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that has a physical weight to it, the kind that presses against your eardrums. Nobody laughed this time. My father's face twisted into confusion, then irritation, the particular irritation of a man who has just lost control of a room he thought belonged to him. "What's wrong with you?" he snapped at Samuel, his voice cutting through the quiet like a dropped plate. Victor Kane, his lawyer, looked equally baffled, glancing between Samuel and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have enough pieces for. Samuel didn't answer my father right away. He turned to him instead with the kind of calm that only comes from decades of watching people lose their composure in front of him. "Sir," he said evenly, "you don't know who you're talking to." My father laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It was the laugh of a man covering for the fact that he had no idea what was happening and needed everyone to believe he did. "This is ridiculous," he said, waving a hand at Samuel like he was swatting away a fly. "The man's confused, probably doesn't even know what day it is." A few nervous chuckles came from the gallery, but they were thinner now, uncertain. Something had cracked the room's confidence, even if most people couldn't say what. I stayed silent. I always stayed silent in front of my father. It wasn't weakness people mistook it for, that for years it was strategy. In the field, the person who reacts first is usually the person who loses. I had learned to let silence do the work that words couldn't. But standing there feeling the weight of that salute still hanging in the air, I found myself pulled backward the way memory does when you least expect it, dragging you under before you can brace for it. I remembered the day I left for basic training. 19 years old, a duffel bag over my shoulder, standing at the bus station alone. My mother had wanted to come, I think. I saw it in her face when I said goodbye at the house, that flicker of something that might have been pride or might have just been fear of my father's reaction if she showed it. My father hadn't even come out of his study. Daniel was at a golf tournament that weekend. Nobody drove me. Nobody waved. I bought my own bus ticket and sat by a window watching the only life I'd known shrink into the distance, and I told myself I wouldn't look back, and mostly I didn't. Graduation from basic training came 4 months later. Family Day, they called it, a day when parents and siblings and spouses would fill the bleachers and cheer as their soldiers marched past in formation for the first time. I remember scanning the crowd during the ceremony just once, just to check, even though some small, stubborn part of me already knew what I'd find. Empty seats where my family should have been. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things over the years that didn't turn out to be entirely true. No letters came that first deployment. Other soldiers in my unit would gather around mail call like it was Christmas morning, tearing open envelopes with photographs of children and dogs and half-finished home renovations. I learned to busy myself elsewhere during mail call. I learned not to expect my name to be called, When I came home the first time, nobody asked where I'd been. Nobody asked if I'd been scared or if I'd seen things I couldn't unsee, or if I was even the same person who had left. My father asked if I'd gotten it out of my system yet, and whether I planned on doing something real with my life anytime soon. I hadn't cried about any of that in years. I didn't cry about it now either, standing in that courtroom with Samuel Brooks still watching me with quiet, steady eyes. But something in my chest had gone tight, an old ache resurfacing in a place I usually kept locked down tight enough that even I forgot it was there. My father was still sputtering, still trying to reclaim the room. "Are we going to continue with this hearing, or are we going to keep entertaining whatever this is?" he said to the judge, gesturing vaguely at Samuel, at me, at the strange electricity that had settled over the courtroom like static before a storm. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, who had said very little up to this point, was studying Samuel with new interest. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, "is there something the court should be aware of?" Samuel looked at me first, as if asking permission. I gave him nothing, no nod, no shake of the head, just stillness. He turned back to the judge instead. "Perhaps," he said, "but that's not my story to tell." And then, for the first time since I'd walked into that courtroom, I felt every eye in the room shift toward me, waiting, wondering, and I realized that whatever silence I had built my life around it wasn't going to protect me for much longer. The recess the judge called lasted only 15 minutes, but it felt longer the way certain silences stretch time, until it goes thin and strange. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a hard wooden bench, my hands folded in my lap, watching the fluorescent lights hum overhead. My father paced near the water fountain with Victor Kane, both of them talking in low, urgent tones, occasionally glancing my way like I was a bomb they hadn't finished defusing. Daniel leaned against the wall a few feet from them, arms crossed, jaw tight. He hadn't said a single word to me since I'd arrived that morning. He hadn't said much to me in years, honestly. We had grown up in the same house and somehow become strangers who shared a surname. I let my mind drift the way it does when the body is still but the past refuses to be. There's a version of my life that exists only in deployment records and after-action reports, a version almost no one in my family has ever seen. Afghanistan, my first real taste of what the uniform actually cost. I was young then, 24, a first lieutenant, trying to prove I belonged in rooms full of men who assumed I didn't. I remember the heat first, always the heat thick enough to chew on, and the particular quiet of a convoy route before something goes wrong. I won't describe what happened that day in detail, some things don't need to be relived out loud, but I will say that 3 of my soldiers came home because of decisions I made in about 4 seconds, decisions I still replay sometimes at 3 in the morning when the house is too quiet. Iraq came later, a different kind of war, urban and unpredictable, the kind where you learn to read a street the way you'd read a person's face. I led a rescue operation there that I still don't talk about, not because it's classified, but because talking about it makes it real again in a way I'm not always ready for. I received a Purple Heart for a wound I still carry a thin silver scar from just below my collarbone. I received a Bronze Star for something I did that day in Iraq that the Army decided was worth recognizing. I never told my parents about either. What would have been the point? My father wouldn't have understood the weight of it, and some part of me, the part still bruised from years of being dismissed, didn't want to hand him something he could shrug off. Instead, every month for almost 15 years, I quietly wired money home. Not because anyone asked, because I could, and because despite everything they were still my family, and some stubborn, aching part of me never stopped hoping that maybe someday it would be enough to earn a different kind of look from my father. That money paid for things nobody ever thanked me for. It paid for my mother's gallbladder surgery the year Daniel said he was between opportunities and couldn't help. It paid to re-roof the house after the storm that took half the shingles clean off the same year Daniel bought a boat he used twice. It paid for my niece's community college tuition quietly through an account my mother knew about and my father didn't, because Margaret Thompson understood things about her husband that she never had the strength to say out loud. Meanwhile, at every family gathering, my father would raise his glass to Daniel, like he'd built the pyramids, thanking him for holding this family together, while I sat 2 seats down invisible, having wired the exact amount that had kept the lights on that winter. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound like a martyr. I made my choices freely and I don't regret the money. What I regret, if I'm honest, is how long I let the silence stand in for the truth. I regret not correcting my father even once when he praised Daniel for things Daniel never did. But there's a strange kind of pride that comes from not needing anyone's permission to be decent, and for a long time I told myself that pride was enough. Sitting on that bench in the courthouse hallway, watching my father's back as he argued in hushed tones with his lawyer, I felt that old familiar tightening in my chest. Not sadness anymore, not exactly. Something closer to clarity. I had spent 20 years being underestimated by men in that family who had never once had to prove themselves the way I had. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like shrinking from that fact. I felt like I was finally allowed to stand in it. Samuel Brooks found me a few minutes before we were called back in. He walked over slowly, favoring his left knee slightly, and lowered himself onto the bench, a respectful distance away. "You don't remember me," he said. It wasn't a question. "Should I?" I asked. "No," he said, a faint smile crossing his weathered face. "But I remember what that pin means, Colonel. Served 26 years myself, military police, before I came here. Spent the last 11 years of my career as a bailiff in courtrooms just like this one." He nodded toward the doors we'd walked out of. "You learn to read a room fast in this job, and I read yours the second I saw you sitting there letting that man talk to you like you're nothing." I didn't answer right away. There wasn't much to say to that. "You don't owe them your story," Samuel added quietly, watching my father through the small window in the courtroom door. "But sometimes silence protects the wrong people." He stood slower than he probably wanted to admit, and straightened his cardigan like it was still a uniform. "I'm going to make a call," he said. "You'll want to see who's coming." I raised an eyebrow. "Coming for what exactly?" He only smiled, the kind of smile that carries history behind it. "You'll see, Colonel. Some debts get paid whether we ask for them or not." And with that, he walked toward the hallway exit, already pulling a phone from his cardigan pocket, leaving me alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of my father's voice rising again behind the courtroom doors, still convinced as always that he was the one in control of this story. When the bailiff called us back into the courtroom, something in the air had shifted the way it does right before a storm breaks. My father took his seat with the confidence of a man who believed the last 15 minutes had been nothing more than an odd interruption already forgotten. Victor Kane straightened his tie and shuffled his papers with theatrical precision, the way lawyers do when they want a room to believe they're in control of a narrative that's already slipping through their fingers. Daniel sat beside them, quiet, arms crossed, refusing to look in my direction. I sat at my table with my own attorney, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Reyes, who had taken my case 8 months earlier after I told her in a single sentence exactly what I suspected my father and brother had done. She had believed me immediately, which was more than I could say for most people in my life. The judge called the room to order, and Victor Kane wasted no time reminding everyone what he believed this hearing was actually about. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter," he said, spreading his hands like he was offering a gift. "Ms. Thompson is contesting her father's handling of a family estate, despite having been absent from this family for the better part of 2 decades. We would ask the court to consider whether someone so disconnected from the day-to-day realities of this family has any standing to challenge decisions made in its best interest." It was a clean little speech, the kind designed to make a jury, or in this case, a judge, feel sorry for the poor, overburdened father trying to manage his estate, while his ungrateful daughter swooped in for a payday. I almost admired the craftsmanship of the lie. Almost. "Your Honor," Patricia said calmly, rising to her feet, "with respect, this case was never about money. My client has never once asked for a single dollar from this estate." She let that land for a moment before continuing. "This case is about the last will and testament of Eleanor Thompson, Ms. Thompson's grandmother, and a very specific clause within that will that requires unanimous agreement among all surviving heirs before any portion of the family property can be sold, transferred, or otherwise altered. I watched my father's jaw tighten. Just slightly, just enough. That clause exists, Patricia continued, because Eleanor Thompson understood something about her son that, frankly, this court is only now beginning to understand. She placed a folder on the table but didn't open it yet. She knew that fairness wasn't something Harold Thompson extended easily, and she wanted to make certain no single member of this family could unilaterally decide the fate of land that took 3 generations to build. My father shot up out of his chair. This is absurd. My mother trusted me completely with that property. Did she? Patricia asked quietly enough that it somehow cut sharper than if she'd shouted it. Because 6 months ago, a signature appeared on a document transferring 70% of that property into a trust controlled solely by you and your son, a signature belonging to Rebecca Thompson, a signature Rebecca Thompson never made. The room went still in that particular way courtrooms do when something true finally surfaces after a long stretch of comfortable lies. That's a lie, my father said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. I glanced at Daniel. He was staring hard at the table in front of him, jaw clenched, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He knew. He had known the entire time. I hadn't come to that courtroom to destroy my family, no matter how much they deserved it after years of being cruel to me for sport. I had come because 3 months earlier, my mother had called me late one night, her voice shaking in a way I'd rarely heard, and told me she'd found paperwork in my father's study that didn't sit right with her. She hadn't understood all of it. She'd only understood enough to know that something was wrong and that if she didn't tell someone, my grandmother's wishes were going to be erased by the 2 men who had always assumed the world and this family belonged to them. I flew home that weekend. I sat with a forensic document examiner 2 weeks later, someone I trusted from my years working alongside legal teams during overseas operations, someone who confirmed almost immediately what my mother had feared. The signature on that transfer document wasn't mine. It had been forged carefully by someone who had studied my handwriting closely enough to fool a casual glance, but not closely enough to fool an expert. I had the proof sitting in that folder on the table in front of me for 3 months. I could have gone to the police immediately. I could have ended this quietly out of the public eye, sparing my family whatever humiliation was coming. But some stubborn, tired part of me needed to see it play out here in this room in front of witnesses, because I had spent 20 years being dismissed quietly, and I was done letting my family's cruelty happen in private while I absorbed it in silence. "Your Honor," Patricia said, closing the folder without opening it, fully saving the full weight of the evidence for the moment it would matter most. "We're prepared to demonstrate that this transfer was executed fraudulently, and that Mr. Thompson and his son were aware of that fraud from the beginning." My father's face had gone the color of old paper. Victor Kane leaned over and whispered something urgent in his ear, but my father wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at me, really looking at me maybe for the first time in years, like he was trying to recalculate everything he thought he understood about his daughter. The judge called for a brief pause to review the newly introduced claim, and as the room shifted with murmurs and rustling papers, I heard a sound outside the courtroom doors that didn't belong to this building at all. The low, distinct rumble of a heavy engine pulling up outside, followed by car doors closing in that unmistakable disciplined rhythm I would have recognized anywhere in the world. Samuel Brooks, standing near the back of the room, turned his head toward the sound and allowed himself the faintest knowing smile. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened with a heaviness that made everyone turn. 4 men walked in, and though none of them wore a uniform, every person in that room could feel immediately that these were not ordinary spectators. They moved the way soldiers move, even out of formation, even decades removed from active duty shoulders, square eyes forward, a kind of quiet authority that doesn't fade just because a person trades fatigues for a suit. I recognized the first man before he'd even crossed halfway down the aisle. Colonel James Whitfield, retired, silver-haired, now heavier around the middle than the last time I'd seen him, but with the same steady gaze I remembered from a briefing room in Kandahar over a decade ago. Beside him walked Brigadier General Ellen Cross, a woman I hadn't seen since a ceremony in Fort Bragg, back when I was still a captain trying to prove I belonged among people twice my rank. Behind them came 2 more men I recognized instantly, Master Sergeant Alvarez and Captain Reyes, both of whom I had served alongside during 2 separate deployments, both of whom I hadn't spoken to in almost 7 years. They hadn't come for the case. That much was obvious from the way they walked past the defense table without so much as a glance at my father or Daniel or Victor Kane. They walked straight toward me, and one by one, without a word of instruction from anyone, they came to attention and saluted. I stood because that's what you do, because some things live in your body deeper than memory, deeper than thought. I returned the salute, my spine straight, my chin level, the same posture I'd carried through checkpoints and briefings and hospital hallways where I'd said goodbye to people I couldn't save. The courtroom had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that has weight that presses on your eardrums and makes even breathing feel loud. "Colonel Thompson," General Cross said, her voice carrying easily through the stillness. "We heard you were in town for something important. Figured we'd come see for ourselves." I felt heat rise in my face, an unfamiliar sensation for me in most rooms, but this wasn't a briefing room. This was my father's courtroom, my father's audience, and for the first time in my adult life, I had no idea how to hold my expression steady in front of him. "General," I said carefully, "this really isn't necessary." "Wasn't a question, Colonel," she said, and there was warmth underneath the discipline in her voice, the kind of warmth that exists between people who've bled through the same kind of days together. "We don't get many chances to show up for the people who showed up for us." The judge, visibly startled by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, cleared her throat. "I'll ask that all parties remain orderly," she said, though her eyes lingered curiously on the four newcomers a moment longer than strictly necessary. My father was staring, his mouth slightly open, the practiced confidence draining visibly from his face. I don't think in that moment he understood what he was looking at. I don't think he understood, even after everything, the scale of what his daughter had actually done with the life he had dismissed as a waste. Samuel Brooks stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the back wall, and to my surprise, he addressed the room directly, his voice low but carrying. "Your Honor, if the court will permit a moment," he said. "I served 26 years in the military police before working 11 more as a bailiff in this courthouse. I've seen a great many people pass through these doors claiming honor they didn't earn." He paused, glancing toward me with something like reverence in his weathered eyes. "I've rarely seen the reverse, someone who earned more honor than she ever let on." "Mr. Brooks," the judge said carefully, "this isn't a forum for character testimony. With respect, Your Honor." Samuel said, "I think the court should know that the woman being mocked in this room an hour ago led a rescue operation in 2011 that saved 11 soldiers from a collapsed structure under active fire. I think the court should know she was awarded the Bronze Star for actions she has never once spoken about publicly. I only know this because General Cross told me herself 20 minutes ago on the phone when I called to ask if what I suspected about that pin was true. I felt my whole body go still." "Samuel," I said quietly, "that's enough." He looked at me, something gentle and stubborn in his expression. "Colonel, respectfully, I think it's time someone else does the talking for a while." I wanted to argue. Some old, deeply ingrained part of me wanted to shrink back into the silence I'd worn like armor for 20 years, the silence that had protected me from disappointment for so long that it had become comfortable, even familiar. But looking at my father's face, pale and shaken, looking at Daniel refusing to meet anyone's eyes, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before that moment. My silence hadn't just protected me. It had protected them. It had let my father believe year after year that his cruelty carried no cost, that dismissing me carried no consequence, because I never once made him sit in the truth of who I actually was. The judge studied me for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "Colonel Thompson," she said, finally addressing me directly for the first time using my actual rank, "is there anything you'd like to add to the record?" I looked at my father, really looked at him the way I hadn't allowed myself to in years past, the anger, past the old ache of being unwanted, and found something underneath it that surprised me, not forgiveness, not yet, but a strange, steady calm. "No, Your Honor," I said. "I think the evidence will speak for itself. It's time it finally got the chance to." Patricia Reyes rose from the table with the folder I had carried in that morning, the one that had sat closed and patient through every insult my father had thrown across the room. She opened it now, slowly, and the sound of the folder's spine cracking felt louder than it should have in a room that quiet. "Your Honor," she said, "we'd like to formally enter into evidence a series of documents establishing a pattern of financial fraud committed against the estate of Eleanor Thompson." She placed the first document on the projector screen mounted at the side of the courtroom, and an image appeared that made my father visibly flinch, a side-by-side comparison of two signatures mine, prepared by the forensic examiner I'd hired 3 months earlier. "This is my client's authentic signature, taken from 12 verified documents spanning the last decade, including military service records," Patricia said. "And this," she gestured to the second signature, "is the one that appears on the property transfer document filed with the county recorder's office 5 months ago, purportedly signed by Rebecca Thompson, granting 70% control of the Thompson family estate to a trust managed exclusively by Harold and Daniel Thompson." The differences once pointed out were impossible to unsee. The pressure was different. The slant leaned the wrong direction. The looping R in my first name curved a way I had never once written it in my life. Our forensic examiner, Dr. Alan Weiss, has 31 years of experience in document analysis and has testified in over 200 cases, Patricia continued. His full written report concludes with a confidence level exceeding 98% that this signature is not authentic. Victor Kane stood already scrambling. "Your Honor, forensic analysis is often subjective, and we would ask for our own expert to review." "You'll have that opportunity," the judge said evenly. "Continue, counsel." Patricia moved to the next piece of evidence, an email thread pulled up on the screen, dates highlighted. "This is a series of emails between Mr. Harold Thompson and Mr. Victor Kane, dated 4 months before the transfer document was filed, in which Mr. Thompson writes, and I quote directly from the record, that he needed to find a way around Rebecca's signature since she'll never agree to this." I watched Victor Kane's face lose whatever color it had left. He hadn't expected those emails to surface. I imagine he'd assumed, the way people often do, that deleted things stay gone. Additionally, Patricia said, surveillance footage from the county recorder's office, timestamped the day the document was filed, shows Daniel Thompson submitting the paperwork in person. Bank records show a transfer of $18,000 from an account controlled by Harold Thompson into an account belonging to a document preparation service 2 weeks prior, a service later found through subpoenaed records, to specialize in signature replication for what they euphemistically call estate planning convenience. The room had gone electric with the particular tension of people watching a carefully built lie collapse in real time. My father sat rigid in his chair, staring straight ahead, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't dare say out loud. Daniel had put his head in his hands. "This is insane," my father finally said, his voice cracking in a way I had never heard before. "Daniel handled all of this. I signed what he told me to sign." Daniel's head snapped up. "Are you serious right now? You're the one who found the guy who does the signatures? You told me it was fine because she'd never even find out, because she never comes around anyway." "Enough," the judge said sharply, and the courtroom fell silent again, though the silence now carried an entirely different flavor than the one that had opened this hearing. It wasn't smug anymore. It wasn't laughing. It was the silence of people watching a family devour itself in public, unable to look away. I felt something complicated settle in my chest as I watched my father and brother turn on each other with the speed of men who had never actually trusted one another to begin with, only needed one another for convenience. There was no satisfaction in it, not really, not the kind I might have imagined feeling years ago when I used to lie awake wondering if my family would ever face consequences for how they treated me. What I felt instead was something quieter, a kind of grief maybe, for the family I had wanted and never gotten, mixed with a strange, clean relief that the truth finally had nowhere left to hide. Samuel Brooks stood near the back wall, arms folded, watching the proceedings with the calm patience of a man who had seen 1,000 hearings end in 1,000 different ways. When my eyes found his across the room, he gave me the smallest nod, the kind you give someone after a long mission finally reaches its end. "You fought one more battle, Colonel," he said quietly, though I don't think he meant for the whole room to hear it. Only I did. The judge was already speaking again, her tone sharpening with the particular authority of someone who had heard enough. "Given the evidence presented today," she said, "this court finds sufficient grounds to void the property transfer in its entirety and refer this matter to the district attorney's office for further investigation into potential fraud and forgery." She looked directly at my father and then at Daniel, with an expression that held no warmth left in it at all. "I would strongly advise both of you to retain separate counsel going forward." My father didn't look at me. He was staring at the table at his own hands, like a man trying to understand how the ground beneath him had disappeared so completely and so fast. The judge's gavel came down with a sound that felt final, in a way few sounds do a period at the end of a sentence that had been 20 years in the writing. "This court hereby restores the original terms of Eleanor Thompson's last will and testament in full," she said, her voice carrying clean and steady through a room that had an hour earlier been laughing at my expense. "The fraudulent transfer is void. Control of the estate reverts to the terms specified by the deceased, requiring unanimous consent among all surviving heirs for any future transaction. This court further refers this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation, and I am ordering a formal bar complaint against Mr. Victor Kane for his role in facilitating a fraudulent filing." Victor Kane didn't even try to argue. He simply sat there pale, already calculating, I imagine, how many other cases he'd need to worry about once this one made the local news. I didn't feel triumphant sitting there. I want to be honest about that because I think triumph is what people expect at the end of stories like this one, and it isn't what I felt. What I felt was closer to exhaustion, the specific exhaustion that comes after carrying something heavy for so long that your body forgets what it feels like to set it down. I felt the weight of my grandmother's wishes finally protected, the weight of years of silence finally justified, and underneath all of it, a small stubborn ache that no verdict could touch, the ache of wishing even now that none of this had ever needed to happen at all. The gallery emptied slowly, people murmuring to each other the way they do after witnessing something they'll be describing to friends for weeks. Daniel left first, practically fleeing through the side doors, without a word to anyone, already reaching for his phone, probably calling a lawyer of his own. My mother stayed seated a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, and when she finally looked up at me, her eyes were wet in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. She didn't say anything either. She didn't need to. Some apologies live in a look instead of words, and I decided in that moment to let that be enough for now. My father was the last to rise from his chair. He stood there a moment, straightening his jacket out of old habit, a gesture I'd watched him make 1,000 times throughout my childhood, whenever he needed to compose himself before facing something uncomfortable. Then, for the first time in longer than I could remember, he looked directly at me and said my name, the way you'd say the name of someone you were meeting for the first time. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice had none of its usual certainty in it. "Can we start over?" I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about every empty seat at every ceremony, every phone call that ended too fast, every dinner where my accomplishments dissolved into silence, while Daniel's imaginary ones were toasted with wine. I thought about the years I'd spent hoping that one day, if I just gave enough, sent home enough, endured enough, he might finally see me the way I'd always wanted to be seen. And I realized, standing there, in that quiet courtroom, that I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt clear. "Respect isn't inherited, Dad," I said softly. "It's earned." I let that sit in the space between us for a moment, watching it land somewhere behind his eyes. Maybe someday we can talk, but not today. I turned and walked toward the courtroom doors, my heels echoing steadily against the old wood floor, and I didn't look back, not because I was angry, but because for the first time in my life I didn't need his reaction to know my own worth. Samuel Brooks was waiting for me near the entrance, standing at something close to attention, the way he had the very first moment he saw that small pin on my lapel. As I approached, he straightened fully and offered one last crisp salute. I returned it, feeling something settle deep in my chest, something like closure, something like being seen fully by a stranger who had understood in a single glance what my own family had refused to understand in 20 years. Outside the military vehicle Samuel had arranged sat waiting at the curb, General Cross leaning against the door with a knowing smile, Colonel Whitfield checking his watch with the patience of a man used to waiting for the people who mattered. "Ready, Colonel?" she asked. I glanced back once at the courthouse steps at the building where my family's carefully constructed lies had finally come apart in the light, and felt something in my chest unclench, slow and quiet, like a fist finally allowed to open after holding on too long. "Ready?" I said, and climbed into the vehicle, and we pulled away from the curb, and I didn't turn around again. If you've made it this far with me, I hope this story reminded you of something important, that the people who overlook you today are not the ones who get to define your worth tomorrow, and that quiet strength, the kind nobody claps for, is still strength. I'd love to know what part of Rebecca's story stayed with you the most. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. We share stories like this one every single day, so if this moved you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next one. Let's keep walking through these stories together.